Alright guys, now we've set up the basic structures of our microservices. We've covered the topics we needed. So, what are we going to do next? Let's go ahead and close these for now. First, let's get some information about what we're going to do. Let's wrap these up as well. Now, friends, let's imagine we're writing a microservice architecture. Our goal here wasn't to write microservices from scratch all the way through anyway. It was to learn how the system works, what the basic practices are, and what we can integrate. We've done these things. Now, we need to focus on how to deploy these to a Kubernetes cluster. And the structures I've used here, like Redis, PostgreSQL, MongoDB. We also need to understand how all of these work together in harmony within a Kubernetes cluster, guys. So, how are we going to do this? Let's take a look at that. Our code is right here. Guys, let's leave our Kubernetes cluster here like this. We have this code, guys. We've written and completed this code. So, what are we going to do with these now? We're going to deploy this to Kubernetes as a microservice. There are some basic things you need to know here. What are microservices in Kubernetes? How do they work? And how are they deployed here? So, there are a lot of unknowns. We'll go through all of them one by one, guys. We'll talk about what happens step by step. First of all, you should already know Docker. What does Docker do? What is its purpose? What are these things called images and containers inside it? We need to talk about these a little bit. So, Docker is basically a virtualization application. Guys, to explain this, I want to give a simple example. Let's say you have an application, any kind of application. For example, let's say it's a Java application. Let me list what is needed for this application to run. Guys, first, what do you need? So, for a Docker application to run, you first need a PC or a physical computer. Then, for this computer to work, you need an operating system. In other words, you need an OS, like Windows, Linux, or Mac, like macOS. So, you need an operating system, because that's how the computer operates. Of course, it doesn't have to be just the ones I mentioned. There can also be other operating systems without a user interface, guys. But the main idea here is this. If we're talking about an operating system with an interface that can interact with us, these operating systems already have both a user interface and the capabilities to manage the computer. So, let's say we've installed it. In other words, we bought our PC and installed the operating system. Then, what do we need for Java applications to run? We need the Java Runtime Environment, or the JDK, friends. Either JRE or JDK will work. It doesn't matter. Both are fine. I need this to run a Java application. What else? And finally, I need my own application, friends. That is, I need it in its JAR form, friends. After getting these, what will be the final step I need to take? Of course, it's going to be run, friends. So, I'm going to tell this application to run. Look, these are the basic things you need to be able to run the code you've written. I'm not talking about these things here. So, teacher, after we have these, let's say we wrote a web application. There definitely needs to be a web server running in the background. There needs to be something here like Apache Tomcat or Glassfish. Yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, if you've written a web application, it definitely needs to be on a web server. But what are we using? We're using Spring Boot. With this, Apache Tomcat already comes embedded. When we export it, it'll also be inside this jar. That's why I skipped that part, just so you know. So, for our jar to run, these are needed. Then it also needs to be run. Do we get the logic? Right. That's the logic. So, what are we going to do here then? I mean, we have our own Java class. So, we need to turn this Java class into a jar. Basically, we first need to build this structure, guys. First, we need to build it and turn it into a jar. So how do we do this? Let's take a look together. First, I'll start with the config server since it can run independently. At the very least, I want you to see how it works, guys. Now, to be able to bring up the config server, to build it, you come to this Gradle section, guys. Here, look, there's the config server. I click here like this and go to the test section. I go to the build section. Look, here's the build option. First, you take a build, guys. That's your first step. After that, you say build depends, and the process of exporting the jar, basically, the build process is completed. Where does it go? Look, right here inside libs. This package you see here is your config server, guys. Let's go to where this is located using Finder, guys. Let's come over here. Look, guys, this is it. When you double-click this, it runs. It can be anywhere on the cloud, on your own local machine. This will work anywhere, guys. Now, let's right-click on this and open it with archive like this. Now it opened it in our current location. Very nice. Let's go inside it now. Let's see what's inside. What's in there? Let's go through it by opening it up like this. You'll see what's in here. You'll notice that everything you need is inside this. Look, you can see the core loaders of the Spring framework here. Then, the code you wrote is under classes. Look, your Bootstrap application is here, and everything else you've written is also inside this. Since there's only one class here, you see just one here. Then, the libraries you need, guys. You know when you say Apache Tomcat? Yeah, all of those are here too. Where's Tomcat? It's way down here, pretty far down. Look, you can see the embedded Tomcat here. And look, with Swagger. So, all the dependencies you might need are here as well. From the outside, you see this as a jar file. Yes, it's a package, a packaged file, my friend. So, who interprets the parameters inside this and brings it to life? Of course, it's either the JRE or the JDK installed on a server that's used to run Java, guys. Nice. That's the logic behind it, guys. The system is set up this way and runs like this. So for the others, you do the same things as well. Basically, you build all of them, guys. So, from here, you need to go to build depends, and create each one individually like this. These initial steps might take some time, so don't worry about why it's taking so long. It just takes a little time. If your computer is under heavy load at that moment, it might take a bit longer. Maybe you have other applications open and so on, so don't let the time it takes bother you too much. At most, it should take 35 seconds, maybe a minute, and then it'll be done. Now, as you can see, all of them have been installed here under this libs folder, friends. So, what are we going to do with these now? At the next stage, we need to upload these to the cloud. Let's assume we've got these now. So here, we've extracted them as EE-app jar, application jar, like that. Alright, great. We've built it from here and turned it into an app jar. So what are we going to do now, friends? I said. What do we need for this to work? Operating system, JDK, and the jar. And then it needs to be triggered. So, friends, you can set up the structures where you can create these. How can you set them up, or how can you create them? You create a Docker image, friends. So, you can turn your own application into a Docker image and transfer it into Docker Desktop, friends. So, how are we going to do this? In other words, how are we going to turn our own application into a Docker image and put it into Docker Desktop? For this, what you need is a Docker file, friends. By using a Docker file, you write out the components you want to use here one by one. You specify, for example, which operating system you'll use, which JDK you'll use. There are certain parameters you need to write in the Docker file, like which application is necessary for you, say, app jar, and that you'll use it and then run it. You write these out one by one in order. After writing them, when you run Docker build, the Docker file creates an image for you on Docker Desktop. So, what should ours be? Let's say it immediately creates an image like Muhammad Ali 55T microservice or maybe Microservice v01. It creates an image for me like this. After that, on my Docker desktop, I'm talking about my local machine here. This is Docker Desktop. Look, here in the Images section, that's where my image appears. After this is created, I send my image to Kubernetes. Guys. So, with this flow, the system gets deployed, friends. Basically, you write the code, build it, and create an image with the Docker file. Then you send the image you created to Kubernetes. Of course, there's a situation here. It won't go through your local Docker desktop. Guys, let me put it this way. You need to push this from Docker Desktop to Docker Hub. That's hub.docker.com, guys. It goes through there. So, it's much more accurate to explain it this way. In other words, the flow will be like this and you'll carry out the deployment process. We're going to do these steps, friends. So, starting from the very beginning here, we'll do the build. We're going to send this from Docker Desktop to Docker Hub. Then, inside the Kubernetes cluster on Google Cloud, we'll deploy these, expose them to the outside world, and test them, guys. So, we'll handle this end-to-end together.